Alrighty, well, welcome to the King Ranch and Kleberg Bluestem Managing Invasive Grasses webinar. I'm Dr. Megan Clayton. Like Pete already said, I'm an extension range specialist down in Corpus Christi at our Research and Extension Center there. I cover a lot of the coastal bend in South Texas, supporting county extension agents and doing research on range-related issues. And of course, King Ranch Bluestem is one of our major issues that a lot of our landowners are fighting. And so it's definitely of high priority to us. So I'm really excited to be able to give you this webinar today, and it's based off of a publication that if you scroll up in the chat box, there's a link to the actual PDF of that publication. I wrote most of that publication, and so when I was putting together the presentation, it's like I'm almost reading that publication to you. So I want to make sure that you all have a copy of that, because that would be a really good reference later. And we'll put that link up again at the end of the webinar. That way you can get it then too. So my first polling question for you is how many actual bluestem species are there in Texas? So either only 2 true species, 6 species, 12 species, or 27 species. And let's see. Looks like Pete's pulling that up. You know what? You can just type your answers right there in the chat box if you want to. Alice says 27. Anybody else brave enough to take a guess? 12, okay. B6. Oh, there we go. Okay, now it's working on our thing. Thanks, Pete. All right, they're still flooding in a little bit. Wow, I didn't mean to make it so hard. It looks like we're almost split on most of the answers, but the highest one is on 12 species. So actually, the answer here, let me broadcast the results there for you, so y'all can see that. All right, we have 40% on 12. So the actual answer is 27. We have 27 species of bluestems in Texas. And so I want to just cover that, you know, when people tell me, oh, God, I hate bluestems, or oh, I love bluestems, it's really not really a true comment, because bluestems as a general group are not either good or bad. They're mostly native plants, and we have 21 excellent natives, including big bluestem, little bluestem, broom sedge, silver bluestem, which is excellent for restoration efforts. And only 6 of those are actually non-native or introduced grass species. And so to say that bluestems are either good or bad is gives me a little bit of heartburn, just because we're clumping a lot of different species that have a lot of different characteristics and values and uses into one single statement. So just be aware that there are quite a few bluestems that we're talking about. The ones, of course, we're going to focus on today is King Ranch and Kleberg, but I want you to also realize, you know, there are 6 introduced recognized species in Texas. Some people categorize these slightly different, but we went with a certain taxonomy, and we're sticking with that one. We have 2 different genera that are actually represented by our introduced bluestems, both Bothrocloa and Dicanthemum. You'll see that the Australian bluestem, which is definitely found around our regions, is also called Caucasian bluestem. And sometimes you hear about its ecotype that was developed called W.W. Beadall. We have Bothrocloa ischaemum, which is our King Ranch bluestem, the main one. And a lot of times we get lazy about saying King Ranch, and we'll say KR bluestem, but that's absolutely the same plant. And it's also referred to as yellow bluestem. And then there's different ecotypes, so different breedings of these plants, and they're bred specifically for certain characteristics, maybe to be able to tolerate drought better, or salinity, or some certain issue in a region. Some of our great plant breeders may have developed other strains. So these ecotypes are referred to as Ganada Plains, WW Ironmaster, WW Spar, or just simply King Ranch Bluestem, but know that all of those derive from the same species. We also have pitted bluestem, pertusa. Pitted is very rare. If you've seen pitted, you would know it's a very specific looking plant on the seed head, but that's not one that we come across very often. We're also going to cover today Kleberg bluestem, which is also called ring bluestem, and I think that comes from the fact that it has some pretty serious hairs on the nodes or the stem joints of the plant. But those ecotypes are actually referred to as T587 or Pretoria 90. So that's referring to the same species, just different strains. And then we have Angleton, which is a fairly common forage grass. Angleton has two different ecotypes you should be aware of, both Gordo and Medio. And sometimes it's also called Ondicanthium. So that's another good one. And then Dicanthium sericium, the silky blue stem, is actually a beautiful grass. It's not quite as common as the other ones, but you'll see silky a lot of times even growing amongst natives. But that one was introduced, so that's not one of our native plants. Okay, so again, we're going to focus mainly on King Ranch and Kleberg bluestem. That's the ones that we have a lot of issues with taking over pastures and seems to have fairly little forage value. So not only are we losing that plant diversity that we would have if we didn't have an invasive grass on our hands, but we've got something that maybe is not quite as useful for most of the year from a livestock perspective. But King Ranch actually came over from China. Maybe came as early as 1917, they think, to California. It made its way over to our Angleton Ag Research Service substation, and they were researched for quite a while and released in 1949 as yellow beardgrass. So originally, King Ranch bluestem was only known as yellow beardgrass. And you might think, why in the world would they bring this plant over in the first place? We have plenty of other introduced grasses that are really great, but you know, King Ranch bluestem is excellent for erosion control and was used for revegetation, especially on highly erodible sites or sites that are really difficult to grow many other beneficial plants. I'll leave names out, but I have talked to current NRCS personnel who said during their even internship days, they were encouraged to help plant and did plant a lot of King Ranch bluestem on lands for revegetation. And you know, it takes hold immediately. It grows really well. It provides some cover for that soil where there was maybe none. And so it was really kind of viewed as a saving grace in many aspects. So that's how it soon ended up on a lot of our roadsides as well. Between 1924 and 1937, sometime, that plant was introduced onto the King Ranch, and it was found there, and then it was taken to an SCS, the Soil Conservation Service, which is now NRCS, in San Antonio, and it was grown at a nursery there and then released for commercial production. So they cannot find any difference between King Ranch bluestem and yellow beardgrass. And so they think the seed that's actually more readily used today is the actual original King Ranch bluestem seed, although they're the same grass. So kind of lost the name yellow beardgrass, and today we only know it as King Ranch. Kleberg, on the other hand, came from South Africa. It has a little bit less dynamic history. It was actually found growing near the King Ranch bluestem on King Ranch in 1939. It was increased as a commercial seed at the Soil Conservation Service in San Antonio, and their seed was actually released in 1944. Kleberg was originally looked at pretty strongly for a pasture forage, hay production, and range reseedings. And if you know anything about Kleberg, or you've heard people talk about Kleberg, you know that a lot of times they talk about how Kleberg is more leafy, better forage than King Ranch bluestem, but that is highly debatable, and we're going to look at that here in just a second. So could you tell King Ranch and Kleberg bluestem apart if you came up on it in a field? What I've been told is without a microscope, you really can't, which is interesting because they're even in different genre. But what's more likely is that depending on where you are, you could take a better educated guess as to whether it's Kleberg or King Ranch Bluestem. Most of the time, you'll sound a lot smarter if you guess King Ranch Bluestem, because obviously King Ranch is a lot more widely distributed across Texas than Kleberg Bluestem is. But here along the coast where I am in Corpus Christi, a lot of these lands, heavy clay soils, it's more likely to be probably Kleberg Bluestem, although we have both growing here. So it's hard to say in many instances, but we got a group in Starr County here, and down there they've got both. So it'd be really difficult to walk up on a field and be able to identify which is which. So Kleberg is generally taller. I believe King Ranch can get up to about 3 feet, but when we do practices such as mowing, it starts to alter the plant height because that plant will actually start to seed out at shorter heights, and it changes their productivity or leafiness. And so it's hard to go by those generalities when you're trying to name something as Kleberg or King Ranch Bluestem. Kleberg does have hairy nodes or stem joints and typically more leafy material, but King Ranch can also have hairy nodes, especially when it's mature. And leaf material can vary, and especially if you don't have both species side by side to compare, it's a little bit hard to make that judgment call. Also, Kleberg is air salinity tolerant, which you could probably guess by looking at its range map, and does best on loamy to clay soils. So you won't typically find Kleberg in deep sands, but King Ranch can do well on dry, rocky, shallow, or clay soils. So that's why as we move north and west, we start to see more King Ranch Bluestem dominating the area and very little Kleberg Bluestem. So basically, can you tell the exact plant apart with the naked eye while you're out in the field? I don't know, that's debatable. But you can certainly take an educated guess based on its location and the type of soils that it's growing in. So let's talk a little bit about management. So first of all, in case you're wondering, what's the problem with them anyway? Why do people sort of seem to have a vengeance out against King Ranch Bluestem? And that's because it is replacing a lot of our grasses. It creates more of a monoculture or a single plant or very few plants growing in an area. And that's not real beneficial from a wildlife standpoint. So the more diversity of plants we have, the more diversity of wildlife that can be supported. And then when we talk about it from a livestock standpoint, even though it is holding our soil steady, which is really a desirable thing because it takes so long to develop even an inch of topsoil, um, at the same time, it's not real useful from a livestock standpoint. So we'll look more at this in a minute, but basically livestock or cattle may eat it when it's new and green in the early spring, but it becomes stemmy very fast, and it has a lot of stem compared to the amount of leaf that it produces. And so it's just not a real desirable grass. So once you get it in your pastures, it's tough to manage, and that's why there's a bit of a negative outlook on that. So there does not appear to be a difference in management between the King Ranch or the Kleberg Bluestem, but what you might find is that the way you apply that management may need to be tweaked a little bit depending on what type of ecological site it's on. So um, that should be may vary on different ecological sites, but definitely the way we would apply the management in a sandy soil would be very different than what we would apply in a heavy clay. And then of course, depending on rainfall patterns for the area, that could really vary how you would approach your management. When we talk about managing not only King Ranch and Kleberg Bluestem, but also really any invasive grass species, there's really three management approaches that I hear people talk about. So I want to kind of cover those real quick to get us all focused on what our options are, because if you've got this grass, what are you going to do about it? So basically I see it as you have three choices: eradication, diversity management, and passive management. So eradication is very, very difficult. To say that we're going to eradicate King Ranch bluestem is quite an undertaking. And I think you'll get a lot of scoffs from many people who've worked with it for any amount of time because unless it's a new introduction into a field that you might be able to stay on spot spraying to get it back out, it's very, very difficult to go backwards. Intensive control efforts, replanting the entire field, continuous follow-ups, and then of course combining all of that with preventative measures such as keeping vehicles that move into the pastures clean, making sure that you buy hay that's clean, doesn't have any of the seed in it, and then of course continuous spot spraying anything that might come up intermittently is going to be really important in order to keep it out of the pasture. So talking about eradicating KR bluestem on a wide scale is a little bit daunting with the technologies that we have right now, but that's not to say that there might not be something that we come up with in the future. The second option would be diversity management. And I'm a big fan of this just because I think having a value of your property for both livestock and wildlife is really important. And encouraging plant diversity is really beneficial for wildlife. So despite having King Ranch bluestem, there are things that you could do to encourage other plants to grow in with KR bluestem instead of having a simple monoculture in your field. And retreatments are going to be key. So not only continuous retreatments, but also applied during the right season and the right time according to when you would expect rainfall for your area. And also doing some of these practices when conditions are in a certain state, such as maybe it'd be better to disc when it's really dry. And we'll talk about some of these specifically as we go through each management tool. The third option would be passive management. So I call this waving the white flag. We say that sentence a lot, it seems like, because we have a 2-year-old and we're like, all right, we're going to wave the white flag today, like we're done. So passive management, that's when you do nothing. And you might think that that sounds really lazy or like you don't care that it's there or you're just giving into your land being nothing. But in retrospect, what we've seen is if you're not prepared to provide the proper intensive follow-up treatments, then it's very likely that some of the management that you apply is going to spread this grass. And if all you're doing is spreading the grass without following up appropriately and intensively enough to actually keep it reduced, then you're probably not doing yourself any favors and you're spending that management money on those practices. So you might be better off to take your management dollars and put them into efforts of protecting areas that are not yet invaded on your property or maybe have a lower density of these grasses so you have more of a chance of potential even eradication in that pasture. So let's talk briefly about management practices that spread this grass. So basically we're going about this backwards and we're saying what we're not going to do because I don't have a silver bullet answer for you just yet about what you could do to completely eradicate this plant. So what not to do. Quick little quiz here. What does mowing accomplish with King Ranch bluestem? Could it A, open up bare ground so other plants can germinate, B, keep the plant from going to seed, C, promote the growth of the plants, or D, mowing does nothing? Give you a couple minutes here to weigh in. I bet there's a lot of you who are like, man, I'd like to elaborate on my answer there, but you would be right. There are certain situations where each of these are considered. A lot of times you hear people say that they like to mow because they open up bare ground, which can be true because if you have that thick monoculture there's not a lot of chance for sunlight to hit the soil surface and other seeds to germinate. But unfortunately, King Ranch Bluestem seeds are so aggressive that they're oftentimes the first thing that comes up. So um, you are right that you would promote the growth of the plant to seed. Um, and it can keep the plant from going to seed. But what we're going to look at here is that um, these plants will actually change over time. So they adapt to what management you're applying to them. So what we've seen is documentation that when you mow regularly, that plant will start to seed out even as quickly as every 2 weeks. And so you'll see this phenomenon kind of on the side of the highway where they mow, say, twice a year on the sides of the highway. Those plants are oftentimes seeding out at shorter heights than areas that are left unmowed. So in those cases, it's best to even just leave the plants unmowed because they're not going to seed out so many times throughout the year. Um, it doesn't necessarily help them to mow. And then what does mowing accomplish? If you said D nothing, that could honestly be true too, because and many times what we've seen is after we mow, within a few months, the density of the plant is back to its original density, if not surpassing it. And so you really created a bigger problem for yourself, although it did temporarily look nice. So of course the plants respond quickly afterwards. That's why they were originally chosen. You know, if they were grazed down pretty short, they could still have the ability to come right back up. And so the thought was to have something covering that soil is better than nothing. The growth form can actually go from a bunch grass, which it originally is, to prostrate, which is growing parallel to the ground. So I know all of you have seen this, if not with King Ranch or Kleberg Bluestem, then with some plants to where when you mow a lot, you'll see it in yards, the plant will actually start to kind of grow out and sprawl along the ground before it comes up. So it just becomes shorter and shorter. And then it starts to seed out, of course, at shorter and faster rates. So mowing, we have not seen any positive effects from. What about deep plowing? Honestly, plowing is one of the best combination tools that we have for helping to get rid of some of this grass, but it has certain circumstances. So when I say deep plowing, you might be thinking of plowing, 18 inches to get rid of brush, but for grasses, maybe only 4 inches would be necessary. It could turn over the seed bank and kind of cover up some of that seed, so maybe all of that high number of seeds waiting there to germinate are not available anymore. And also if you plow, especially when it's dry, you could dry out some of the roots, and so you'd kill some of the mature plants. King Ranch can recover from plowing alone within months without follow-up treatment if you get any rainfall at all. So plowing in and of itself does not seem to have much of a delay in keeping King Ranch Bluestem at bay. Well, what about disking? Disking is often encouraged late winter to promote forb growth, and it is still a great option. It's not a long-term fix, but disking, if you do it regularly enough, could certainly create diversity, allow other plants to come up in its place. Oftentimes you'll get weeds as soon as spring comes around, spring green up, and this could really create a lot of diversity and new foods for wildlife that would attract them to that area. It eventually exposes soil and spreads King Ranch Bluestem with time. So again, you have to keep on it. It's not something that's going to be a one and done treatment. But if you have especially dry soils or sandier soils, coarser soils, this treatment could temporarily put a little bit more plant diversity into your mix. But long term, again, disking is not necessarily an answer. Okay, so what about prescribed fire? We know study after study shown that dormant season fire spreads this plant. I always say KR loves fire. It loves it. It thrives off of it. You would think that you're putting all of the plants back on the same playing field, but King Ranch and Kleberg Bluestem can outcompete most of our natives so quickly that that's what comes back. So I even know people on this webinar who have had stands of other introduced grasses, and through repetitive burning have turned that into a KR bluestem field. So it's just the innate competitive nature of these plants that's taking over. So the thought was, well, summer fire is a lot more hot. It's a lot more harsh on the plants, and it might be enough just to control the plants, especially when you have such high fuel loads like you can get with these monocultures of introduced plants. Um, so what we found is that you may actually get some suppression of the plants up to a year, but because of crown survival or single plants like surviving down at the base and new seedlings from the seed bank that's already there, they quickly surpass the original densities. So you haven't really gained anything after a year. So that would need to be a situation where you were able to apply this fire repetitively, and we all know that that's not always possible because of weather conditions. And then, of course, your rate of return, if it lasts 3 months or 1 year, is going to depend on your soil type, how productive it is, and also your rainfall. So obviously, the quicker you get rainfall, all those seeds are going to germinate, and you'll have nice new green little sprouts of KR Bluestem more quickly than if you weren't to get rainfall for a year. So that's a lot of the variation that you'll see within a lot of the research project results is just depending on soil type and rainfall. So what about grazing? They were originally kind of developed with the thought that, okay, they can cover the soil, they're great for erosion control, but also specifically Kleberg bluestem was thought to be a great forage grass and even for hay production. So um, grazing as an early growth stages may provide decent cattle forage. So by that I mean when spring green up comes, you've probably got, I don't know, I'm just guessing because it's so dependent on location and rain, but maybe 2 or 3 months of really green grass to where it provides decent cattle forage. So you might still have to supplement a little if they have nothing else to eat. Um, but it does provide some green grass. And I know people who very successfully, because King Ranch Bluestem or Kleberg Bluestem's all they have, they intensively graze this grass in the early spring to take advantage of that green growth, and then hope that when it comes back, they can take advantage of another round of green growth. Um, so if you have only this grass, it is possible to manage it as a forage grass and get some utilization out of it. I think the frustration comes in that it gets stemmy so quickly after that, and the cattle will avoid it. So what our fear is that those plants mature so quickly, it becomes high in unpalatable stem material. And then, of course, our livestock are going to tend to avoid those plants, and this increases the grazing pressure on your other plants. So if you do happen to have some decent natives still scattered around your pasture, the livestock are going to hit them extremely hard. So then you've got a situation to where inadvertently you're overgrazing your native grasses because livestock have a preference for them. So the first thing to die off when we get a drought or when they're grazed too heavily is going to be the more desirable native grasses. So unfortunately, if we don't maintain really moderate or low stocking rates in situations where we do still have some diversity in the pasture, it's very easy to become overgrazed quickly. And then inevitably, once your natives die off, the King Ranch Bluestem is going to take over that area. You want to be especially cautious, of course, during drought and in the fall. So in the fall, typically that's when our natives are doing really well, and King Ranch Bluestem is going to be extremely stemmy. So be very cognizant of having low stocking rates at those times, or moving them into a pasture that has new grasses to graze that don't include your thick KR Bluestem. Okay, chemical control. So chemical control is honestly one of the best ways, best defenses we have at keeping this plant at bay. What's typically applied is glyphosate, which is just Roundup. But be aware, glyphosate is a non-selective herbicide, which means that it works on green material, of pretty much any plant. So if you put out broadcasted glyphosate, you're going to nuke a lot of the plants that are in that pasture, not just KR Bluestem. Sometimes people have tried wicking, which is like, say you have a Bermuda grass pasture and Bermuda's fairly short, especially early in the season, and your KR Bluestem gets a little bit taller. You kind of wipe this glyphosate on the leaves at a higher height so that you're not impacting your Bermuda grass or your desirable grass. And sometimes people have luck getting rid of it in that way, or at least suppressing it in that way. We like glyphosate also as a spot spray. So if you have an area where you notice KR Kleberg Bluestem coming in, it's possible to go in there with just even a backpack sprayer, a little pump-up sprayer, and spot spray the areas where you see these invasive grasses and get rid of them before they have a chance to take over and become a monoculture. Another option for only Bermuda grass, Pastura, is a bare product, a granular product. We're probably most familiar with Pastura because it's applied for sandburs. Sandbur is going to be applied really early in the year, so you're looking for sandburs to be only, an inch and a half tall when you apply that. Pastura has a 2EE recommendation label for King Ranch Bluestem. And what you would do is you would put out like an ounce of Pastura, wait about, I think it says 4 to 8 weeks, so I usually say 6 weeks later, you'll put out another ounce. And it's only labeled as a suppression. So I don't recommend this honestly all that often because my experience has been that it's very short-lived if you do get both applications out. Very ineffective long-term, but they're telling you in that recommendation label that this is just a suppression technique. Where people have used this and liked it is in their coastal Bermuda grass pastures. They're putting this out and it gives the Bermuda a chance to grow. So they'll fertilize the Bermuda and they'll have a really great cutting or two off of it that year. But then usually if they get decent rainfall, they're looking at the same situation the next year. The problem I've had with research projects using Pastura is that I'll get out my first ounce and then 6 weeks later it'll turn dry. So typically that's put out mid to late summer, and then 6 weeks later, if we're dry, there's no green material for that Pastura to even effectively work on. So of course it's not going to be much of a suppression at that point. So Pastura is an option, but that's something that we recommend in very limited situations, and again, like with coastal Bermuda grass pastures. Okay, so like I say in the publication, like what if you want to give it a 1-2 punch? You're like, okay, I understand that these single treatments don't necessarily work. They're short-lived. You may have to repeat them over and over again, but what if we put some of these technologies to use as combinations? What effect could we get? Well, we threw literally everything we could think of in a grid situation, small plots at King Ranch and Kleberg Bluestem, and this was led by a graduate student, Megan Lesack. Jamie Foster was the PI on the project, as well as Kim McQuistion, and then Trent Tyner was with Texas Parks and Wildlife, who sponsored the project. We saw most of these combinations return to their pre-treatment levels within 3 to 6 months, but all of them did definitely within 2 years. Usually that delay was due to a lack of rainfall. Plowing combinations lasted the longest, which you could imagine that would be so. Plowing, basically you're starting over because you're turning over a lot of that seed. You're trying to uproot the plant, hopefully dry that plant out. And so plowing in combination with other treatments lasted closer to the 2-year mark. Best bet would be to plow glyphosate and reseed. And there's variations in how you would go about reseeding a pasture. You might actually want to mow it to get good glyphosate coverage first and then plow it. Just depends on what type of soil you have and what situation you're in. But basically the plowing and glyphosating to prepare the pasture for reseeding is necessary in order to knock this plant back. This whole treatment could cost anywhere from $150 plus if you're reseeding with a nice native mix. So it's not to be entered into lightly. And I feel like we're missing a valuable piece of information. And I believe that is my next question. Yes. Okay. So what key information are we missing before I would feel confident saying, yeah, why don't you go out and replant that pasture? Would it be the cost of eliminating the King Ranch or Kleberg Bluestem in the field before planting? How often the combination treatments would need to be applied to have a long-term effect? The germination rates of the seed that's in the soil? Or we know our current management technologies won't work anyways? Which one would you guess? And I had a question there. Will this presentation be available as a PDF or PowerPoint? I could send you the direct PDF. Honestly, the publication covers it all and in better explanation. So I would point you towards the publication. But if you'd like the presentation PDF, I could definitely send that to you. And I'll give you my email at the end of this presentation. Absolutely. Okay, so it looks like actually none of you are really wrong in your answer, but the answer I'm looking for is germination rates of seed in the soil, because for me to tell somebody, man, yeah, just spend $150 on per acre, no big deal, renovate that land, and we don't have an answer for how long the seed that's left in that soil is actually viable for germination, meaning that seed could sit there for a number of years and still come up when the conditions are right. So maybe they finally get sunlight or they get moisture that they need, and new plants will spurt up. And what we've seen is these plants are difficult to control. So now you've got newly established native plants trying to grow their roots and get established, and you've got King Ranch Bluestem, highly competitive grass, reseeding at the same time. So until we know what our germination rates or how long that seed is still viable in the soil, it's very difficult for me to recommend um, this plow glyphosate reseed combination in too many instances. So we did have a professor look at germination rates in controlled environments and in the laboratory, and there were a lot of issues, including it growing a fungus. So it was difficult to nail down an exact length of time that you would be concerned about these germination rates. And so as a result, Dr. Josh McGinty, our agronomist here at Corpus Christi, and myself started this project. You see our massive fence there with tarp around the edges. This field, you see the hay bales in the back behind my truck. It is solid King Ranch Bluestem. I don't know, maybe Kleberg Bluestem, but solid. And they hay it, so it is being put to use. The entire pasture is probably 60-something acres. We took a small area and divided it in half, and basically we're nuking it with glyphosate or Roundup and allowing it to grow back and seeing how long the seed that's in that soil, because it's been nothing but a King Ranch Bluestem pasture for so long, how long that seed's going to germinate. So where you see the tarp kind of falling down in the middle, that tarp that's stretched across there is dividing our plots in half, and the plots closer to my truck are being tilled. So we're trying to utilize, like in the crop world, they'll till to actually get weed seeds to germinate so they can kill them before they plant the crop. And so we're tilling that half to try to get the KR Bluestem to come out a little bit faster uproot any plants that are there that weren't killed with the glyphosate. So we're keeping track of this and hoping that within a year or two we have some answers for you as far as how long that seed might still be viable in a natural environment, which would give us some sort of idea about how long you might want to continue to glyphosate or maybe even glyphosate and plow your pasture before you go ahead and reseed with that expensive seed mix. We're also hoping to look at some new technologies with soil sterilants like seed sterilants that may be able to be planted over. We haven't started that project yet, but that's in the works and we're really excited about it as well. Okay, so let's talk about prevention. If you don't have King Ranch Bluestem, then you're very lucky, and it might be that you just live in a part of the world that it's not as affected, because you saw there were quite a few counties that were still blank within that map of King Ranch Bluestem. But if you have pastures even that aren't real invaded, or you know that it's in your area, but you've been lucky enough to avoid it so far, what are some preventative measures you could take to try to keep this plant off your place? The first one, of course, is learn to identify it. If you don't know that you have invasive grasses of any kind, it's really difficult to be proactive as far as getting rid of them before they become a problem. It's typically when they start to take over about a third of the pasture that we'll get a call like, what the heck is this? It's really been coming on the last few years, like, oh, dang, I wish you called me 3 years ago, because it's highly likely that we could have done something about that. Whereas at this point, they're almost looking at totally eradicating what's there and replanting. Definitely monitor the roads. Roadsides are one area that they usually invade in from first, and hay feeding areas. So you can, of course, be really careful when you're buying hay. You could check out people's fields. You can get references. You can look through the hay bale, but it is still possible to get some weed seeds or undesirable seeds, of course, in your hay. And so feeding in specific areas and then monitoring those areas for strange plants or plants that you're not too sure about and getting those identified is really key. Spot spraying new recruits. So once you do notice some, honestly, our best method right now is to spot spray with glyphosate, and that would be at like a 1 to 1.5% rate. One thing I would change in the publication that I'm going to give you a link to is that for broadcast control, we suggest 3.3 quarts per acre, which is what is suggested for like a Bermuda grass. That's probably the highest rate of glyphosate that's put out. And what we're using on our trial, where we're trying to look at germination rates, is only 1 quart per acre, and that came out of AgriLife Research. They did some work out in Yoakum area and found that 1 quart per acre will work. So know that that rate might be a little bit high or maybe unnecessary, and you could drop that down some. Be careful with equipment. So if you have King Ranch Bluestem in one pasture, not so much in another, you inadvertently could be introducing that to your pastures, not only when you move your cattle from one to another and they defecate and leave seed, but also when you move your equipment or drive through one pasture into another. Definitely be careful with where you're moving. And it is a pain, but if you have a large issue with Kleberg or King Ranch Bluestem in your area, if you are able to keep it out of some pastures, then you're going to want to be very picky about who drives in there. So that might mean pipeline companies, hunters, even friends visiting. You may request that they have a weed wash on their equipment before it's brought in, so that they're not bringing in those seed and introducing them back into your pasture. And then a lot of times people want to maintain buffers next to King Ranch Bluestem fields. So say your neighbor or one of your other pastures is pretty much a King Ranch monoculture, and you have a pasture that's maybe been spared a little bit and you still have good native grass coverage or another more productive introduced grass cover, then you may want to leave some undisturbed vegetation around the edge. Don't disc or mow right up to the edge. Don't overgraze that pasture. Don't burn up to the edge. leave that vegetation along there so that it doesn't have a chance to blow that seed in and establish in the pasture. Also, sometimes people like to maintain something similar to fire guards, which would be like a bare area, still drivable, but a bare area that maybe they would glyphosate regularly or um, keep open so that there wouldn't be the opportunity for that KR to come over into their beneficial pasture. But be aware that that is very intensive. So you're going to have to keep on that, or else you're actually going to create a vector to bring that KR Bluestem into the field by exposing that bare ground. So that one could work against you if you're not prepared to put the work into it to keep that maintained long term. So there's my email address, and again, I am glad to send you a PDF, but honestly, if Pete will help me out with that, uh, pasting that link to the publication, it's PDF, you'll see that I built this presentation directly off of our publication, and it kind of outlines everything we talked about, and not only that, but gives you a little bit more details about what we found in some of our studies. So with that, did y'all have any questions for me, or were there any questions that I missed while I was going?
No, I didn't see any questions that you missed. If you have any questions, feel free to type them down in the chat pod.
Maybe I put everyone to sleep.
Well, I'm gonna go ahead and put a link to the survey, and I'm gonna go ahead and pop it out.
Okay, great.
Ask the attendees to please, the survey's gonna pop out. Y'all go ahead and fill it out. Take time and get it done. All responses are anonymous. We appreciate any comments. And as we sit here and wait for the next for more questions, let me go ahead and say that our next webinar is going to be on August the 2nd, and it's grazing, hunting, and livestock leases, and Tiffany Dow Lashmit will be our speaker. If you're not following us, you can follow us on Facebook. We try to post twice a week, some kind of educational post. So if you go to facebook.com/txrange, you can follow our website. I think you have some questions coming in there. I'm gonna go ahead and pop out the survey.
Alrighty. Yeah, it looks like Steven asked, no, not Steven, Charles. Whoops, the survey just covered up, I think. Charles said, does the highway department still seed KR? You're right, Charles. So a lot of this was spread into our pastures thanks to Texas Department of Transportation seeding the highway because it's so valuable as an erosion control type of plant. And you can all see that it does really well as a roadside plant. Fortunately, came into our pastures. No, actually, TxDOT is really a great supporter of planting natives at this time. Unfortunately, the do is already done. It's already out there, and so it's difficult to go back. But as far as I know, they are not still seeking to plant KR Bluestem. They're really seeking to support the development of more native species that could be planted and do very well on the highway under different circumstances in all of our ecoregions. So as far as I know, they've stopped that practice, but that is how it largely got along the sides now. Bob asked, is it possible to plow it under deep enough to prevent germination? Sure, yeah, definitely plowing can turn the seed over. It depends on the soil type, how effective that'll be. But definitely you can, it kind of turns the topsoil over, and so you're burying that seed so it won't germinate. And then hopefully once we get an answer about how many years that might be able to come back, you'll know before you work the soil again so you don't bring it back up. Leonard asks, have you seen any success with modulating growth by altering the rhizosphere and interrupting soil microbes? So clearly I can't even say the words. No, I'm just kidding. Are you aware of an allelopathic soil association? I'm not aware of any, and it has not been proven that there's any allelopathic soil association. That's kind of where, I don't know how to explain that well, but like a chemical would keep other plants away. It's more that it can outcompete it. So it literally uh, grows faster. It literally takes up that space in the soil much quicker than any other can, and then it seeds out so quickly that it's adding seed constantly back into our topsoil. So there's always a seed supply to keep that going. And I really haven't seen anything done with the soil microbes. And as far as trying to keep it from growing, I think the problem you would have is that it's so adaptable that if you had a interruption in our soil microbe cycle, you're going to also interrupt the ability for other plants to get established. So I think we might be better off looking at like potential soil sterilants that could be used with reseeding, or situations like that to make that a little bit more quick and then maintain the valuable soil microbes that are already there, because they're kind of what's keeping all of the plants happy. The Starr County group, they asked about the nutritive value of King Ranch Bluestem. I do hate giving numbers because it varies, especially because KR is constantly growing and maturing, and as it matures, its value, both crude protein and digestibility, is rapidly decreasing. But at one time, our livestock specialist, Dr. Joe Pascal, I'll drop this on him, he told me that he estimated King Ranch Bluestem when it was green to be about 7% crude protein, which isn't great, but it's something, especially if that's all you've got. But anyway, don't hold me to that. That was just a general conversation with Joe. And it's hard to put a number on a plant that's constantly changing like that. Jimmy asked, is glyphosate effective wicked on stem? So it will work on the stem, on the green material of the plant, the growing material. It's probably best if you get it on some of the leaves. So that's why a lot of times they'll put that out when the plant's grown taller than like the coastal Bermuda, for instance. Another thing is sometimes they can use a low rate of glyphosate at certain times on Bermuda and not have a long-term impact on it. So that's something else that's been thrown around. Leonard, any recommendations for managing KR in a floodplain? Oh gosh. No, I'd actually have to think a little bit on that. Uh, when it's dry, obviously, you could utilize some of the other techniques that we were going in, but I don't even know what you would replant there that would outcompete any small seeds that did come up later. So I'd really have to think on that one, Leonard. But if you want to email me, definitely I can look into that a little bit further if anyone else has any suggestions. And then Pete was just reminding again that if you did register for a CEU, go ahead and type your email address in to make sure we've got that. Let's see. Oh, okay. Dawn said, would this apply to tanglehead? Oh, okay. So tanglehead is in a few counties in South Texas. It's kind of a similar booger. Tanglehead is effectively a native plant, but on some of the, especially the red dirt soils, it seems to be acting much like an invasive grass. And so, yes, it's the same. We also found, I believe it was a Mazapir, works really well on tanglehead, but again, that's not a real selective herbicide, so you're kind of willing to sacrifice all that's there. Um, but Dawn, if you wanted to email me, I actually have a presentation on tanglehead that I could send you with the work that's been done on that. We had some really good luck because tanglehead is a really good forage grass. Patch burning and grazing, so burning smaller areas and putting cattle on it very heavy to utilize that tanglehead right away seems to be one way to at least utilize the grass. Ingrid, do you have any experience with native species such as little bluestem effectively shading out and thereby outcompeting KR? No, no, and no. Unfortunately, I'm a huge, huge supporter of planting native species. I don't think you should be looking at much else, but they are not good competitors with KR. In fact, I've talked to our forage specialists, and I've really been interested in figuring out if there's even any introduced grasses that have been bred for quick growth that are more valuable from a livestock standpoint that could outcompete KR, and they don't know of any. So we're looking at a very, very competitive grass, especially once it's established. So um, I don't know of any native species that could shade that one out just because it grows so much more quickly. Is new chemistry being researched to control KR? Gary, yes. It seems slow, I think, from a chemical control standpoint, especially because it's very difficult to develop chemicals that are grass selective chemicals, so that take out certain grasses and don't work on others. And so that's why we have these, you know, broad control methods like with glyphosate. But definitely we're looking at them, and I think I even saw Bayer is on here case. We're looking at it, one of their sterilants that doesn't necessarily go deep into the soil. We're interested in maybe that being able to sterilize the seed that's there and then be able to replant like with a seed drill, native seed drill. Behind that, there's some work up north with that on some difficult invasive grasses. But definitely we're still looking into this grass. We haven't given up, and new technology is developed all the time. So hopefully at some point we hit on something to where we could at least get this grass down in density enough that we feel like we could get control of it one day. Ronnie says, I have spot sprayed KR on an area about 40 feet by 50 feet on Bermuda pasture last year. With this drought, all in that spot is dead other than some weeds. With all this rain, Bermuda is growing back in the area. What should I do next? Ooh, okay. So it looks like you killed your KR and Bermuda is coming back, which is excellent. Um, if your Bermuda's coming back, I don't know if you typically fertilize regularly, but Bermuda really does appreciate fertilization. Um, Also, if you do see any KR coming back, I would go back and make sure to spot spray right away. So I don't know how great you are at identifying it when it's a seedling, but definitely I would get on that pretty quick because that's pretty exciting results right there. I don't have anything else to tell you because I wouldn't do anything else drastic because you've already got your Bermuda coming back. Um, so I would just keep monitoring to make sure that your KR is still at bay. Mark says, I would like to suggest the addition of ammonium sulfate if using well water for your glyphosate mix. Okay, so it probably depends on what your well water consistency is, but it sounds like in Mark's area, ammonium sulfate is needed. Um, I'm not real familiar with that, Mark. The only thing we've done research on is looking at the pHs of different water, and we actually made sure we changed the water to a certain pH, and then we mixed it with chemicals. Our chemicals are highly acidic, um, so they pretty much all go acidic no matter what the original pH is, and so we didn't find much use in using any additives for that, and we had no control differences when we used different pHs. That's the only experience I have with water, so that might be something to look into. Ronnie says, I use Roundup. Okay. Um, Ingrid says, gama grass in a floodplain. Oh, okay. So she's suggesting maybe eastern gama grass plantings for your floodplain. That is a great grass that does well with water, clay soils. Might be something to look into. It kind of depends too on how large your floodplain is. Charles Mims, I have a Klein pasture that seems to be tolerating KR. Okay, Charles, I'd be curious too what type of soils you have. Um, So he has Klein, and seems like the Klein is competing well with KR, which Klein could certainly do, and definitely it's more desirable from a livestock standpoint. Um, oh, rocky clay, yeah, okay, cool. Well, I hope that continues, but definitely keep me posted because it's interesting to hear different perspectives. Leonard says, any success with prescribed fire in the summer and spot spraying resprouts? My experience with prescribed fire, even in the summer, is that, and it's the same with tanglehead, by the way, if the tanglehead guys are still on here. Um, Immediately after the fire, you see all these seedlings coming back, and they're your most competitive grasses. I mean, they come back real quick, and they're all over. So I don't even know about spot spraying. We did try some fire followed by glyphosate, and you just still got that seed bank there. So that's sort of still your question is what are you going to do with the seed bank that's still present? And fire definitely promotes that grass. So you're going to see not only a little bit of crown survival depending on how hot your fire was, but also for sure lots of seeds germinating after the fire. Um, so I guess I'm saying spot spraying might be a little bit daunting because we're not only talking about the crowns that are surviving, but also those seeds that are coming back up. Okay, and I sure hope I didn't miss anybody's question. If I did, I apologize. Please type it in again. Or if I didn't answer your question completely, webinars a really weird deal because you are just sitting here in a room by yourself, so I can't get any feedback from you.
Yeah, I don't think you missed any questions. I've been kind of keeping up with the questions.
Oh, good. Thank you, Pete.
You all have any questions? Feel free to type them in the chat pod. Again, thank you all for being here today, and thank you, Dr. Clayton, for being our speaker. Great
My pleasure.
information. I think before I end the meeting, I'll wait around and see if any other questions pop up.
Thanks for attending, guys. If you do have a certain situation, feel free to email me. I'd really be interested in learning about it. I know anecdotally we've seen that during certain times, if you just leave it alone, King Ranch Bluestem even seems to decrease in density on very sandy soils. Um, so a lot of this stuff we've seen, maybe we haven't done hardcore research projects on every single soil type in every single region, but we've seen anecdotally some really neat stuff. So I'd be interested in keeping up with that. My pleasure, everyone.